Thank you guys so much for joining in. As Misty said, I am David. I am a transition vocational rehabilitation counselor, or TVRC, with the Texas Workforce Commission, Texas Workforce Solutions, Vocational Rehabilitation Services. I know it kind of sounds like a mouthful, but TWC and TWS are one and the same. And we have this subset of services called vocational rehabilitation services. And really, what this is meant to do is to target transition age youth. So those are going to be, uh, let me just state the purpose of our services first. So is to really help people with disabilities obtain and maintain employment that is consistent with the strengths and interests and abilities and aptitudes, right? So what I like to point out here a lot is this obtaining and maintaining employment. Since our target audience is transition age youth, there's a thing that comes before this obtaining and maintaining employment. It's called preparing for employment or pre-employment transition services, which I'll get to in a moment. But just to kind of make things sort of streamline, I want to explain this. Our services are eligibility based, right? So we ask that you maintain eligibility requirements throughout the life of your case, which again, I'll explain in more detail in just a second. We're not intended to be emergency services, and the services aren't necessarily time limited, but they're not intended to be long term. They're arranged by vocational rehabilitation counselor, which is me, with consideration for that individual's choice. So the eligibility criteria is one. We have four different criterion here. The customer has to have either a physical or mental impairment. That impairment constitutes or results in a substantial impediment to employment. That customer requires VR services to help prepare and enter the workforce, and the customer is presumed to have a goal of achieving an employment outcome, unless trial work experience demonstrates that there's clear and convincing evidence that they can't achieve an employment outcome. So what transition services are, it's a subset of vocational rehabilitation services. That target audience there is ages 14 to 22. They're provided to help students with disabilities transition from that high school life to a successful work life and independent living. Simply stated, we want to make sure that your student, your learner that has a disability is as prepared as possible for the world of work after they graduate high school, right? And we accomplish this by addressing 5 broad categories of pre-employment transition services. I like to start off with this first one here. It's career exploration. It is often the case that I get the student that doesn't know what they want to do, right? And so I'm like, okay, that's great, that's perfect. It's a good starting point because we're at square one and we have many squares that we can move to, right? So I'll start off with career exploration. We usually do, a very quick assessment. And the second one I like to move into is this job readiness. I know it says number 4, but in my opinion, I like to move into the job readiness first and then the work-based learning. So job readiness training, that's going to be where we address those vocational concerns that they might have, right? Your transition age youth may not have the experience that's required to go get a job. That job readiness training will address those concerns and fill in some of those gaps. Then we move into the work-based learning. Just like it sounds, it is work-based, right? So they have the opportunity to go onto a work site as well, to help build those necessary skills. Self-advocacy is also a very, very important part. I think, in my opinion, I think the self-advocacy piece is going to be the most important part of all of this, because it is often the case that, that impediment to employment, it might be that they don't have the voice to really raise their hand and ask for help, right? When they're out there in the real world, They need to be able to learn the self-advocacy. I like to tie these in two together, job readiness and self-advocacy, because you know, again, I mean, it's super, super important that they're prepared as possible for that world of work. We also have this counseling on post-secondary opportunities. Post-secondary can be college, right? I know a lot of students are that I talk to are interested in going in and experiencing the college life, but it doesn't have to be college. It could be a trade school or vocational school, and we'll be, more than happy to provide that guidance for them to enter that post-secondary opportunity. Also, just a note here, VR services, vocational rehabilitation services, they, just because they age out of this 14 to 22 range, doesn't mean that services stop. I get that question quite a bit, actually. Once high school ends, they have the opportunity to continue VR services with an adult counselor. Since I'm a transition counselor, I can only work with individuals aged 14 to 22 as long as they are enrolled in a school, whether that's secondary education or post-secondary education. The transit TVRCs were assigned schools. We actually partner with schools all in Texas. I just happen to be assigned to Capella High School. And then the VRCs, they're counselors with general caseloads, and sometimes regular VRCs, vocational rehabilitation counselors, will have a school assignment. So a lot, and the reason our services exist in the first place is because we know typically individuals with disabilities are underrepresented in the workforce, right? What WIOA, or the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, what it established was the earlier that we can engage folks in the VR services, the better off they're going to be later on, right? The VR program, we're actually required to spend 15% of our entire budget on these pre-employment transition services. So that's why we come in and say, hey, we can work with them as young as 14 years old. So as soon as they get into high school, we want to get them into at least one of these pre-employment transition services that I was talking about earlier. So potentially eligible is typically where I will start students off. I get a lot of questions about the meaning of potentially eligible. All that really means is it's a chance to try out services. It's not that they're not eligible for services, it's just that they haven't submitted a full application yet. Typically with potentially eligible, there's really three different things that we ask. They have to meet the definition of a student with a disability. It's not intended to really go around VR services, but it's meant to sort of be a way for them to try out services before fully committing to an application. There are some limitations. We can only do these pre-ETS services while they're potentially eligible. Once they come onto a full application, they do have access to a wider array of services. And typically when I'm working with a potentially eligible customer, I will, if I notice that, hey, they could benefit from an additional services that we have for, within the scope of vocational rehabilitation, I'll suggest an application. But typically they can stay in this potential eligible phase, I would say, up until they're ready to graduate, and then we'll get them into an IPE, which is an individualized plan for employment. This is how to get started. I won't go through all of that. Instead, what I will do is navigate our TWC website with you guys. So this is our website, twc.texas.gov. This was a very popular site a couple of years ago when the pandemic started. But just to sort of flush this out, if you visit this website, you can navigate to this middle part right here. Well, there's several options that you can navigate to, but I would suggest going to people with disabilities. And depending on who you are, you can either click on adults or youth and students. I'm going to go ahead and click on youth and students because it takes you to this sort of overview, eligibility. Feel free to read through at your leisure. But I like to place emphasis right here. Start my VR. This is a relatively new thing that that TWC has implemented to get people engaged quicker in our services. So once you click on Start My VR, it'll take you to this website and it'll ask for just basic information. And what will happen is you'll be contacted pretty quickly. Usually happens the same day. You'll be contacted by one of our VR staff and then assigned to your VR counselor. So, for example, if you're living in Capel, they'll look up like who covers Capel High School, and my name will pop up there, and they'll just place it on my caseload, and I'll reach out accordingly. So yeah, pretty easy. twc.texas.gov, people with disabilities, youth and students, Start My VR. Let's see, I don't think there's really very much other information. Oh, this is also important too. So our federal funding, we have an expenditure amount that we need to spend. Like I was saying, we have to spend at least 15% of our federal budget on pre-employment transition services. We have that money to spend. Our goal is to invest that money into getting your student with a disability as prepared as possible for that world of work. So we have the funds there, and we want to get you guys engaged.